When the Blitz began in 1940, Britain entered a new kind of war, one fought not on distant battlefields, but above its own cities. Each night, the hum of bombers rolled in from the Channel, and the sirens wailed across London, Liverpool, and Birmingham. Yet the true soldiers of that front were not in uniform. They were the shopkeepers, miners, mothers, and children who learned to fight back, not with weapons, but with walls of earth, timber, and ingenuity. This is how ordinary Britons built hidden shelters, and how those forgotten designs still teach survival today. When Prime Minister Churchill called for a nation of defenders, Britain answered. The Home Guard was formed to resist invasion, while the Air Raid Precautions Service, the ARP, took responsibility for protecting civilians. But official shelters were scarce, materials were rationed, and factories prioritized the war effort. For millions of families, the government issued Anderson shelter, a corrugated steel hut buried under soil, simply wasn't available or practical. So civilians began adapting what they already had: basements, coal cellars, and gardens, turning them into improvised safe havens. Every British city had basements, and in the early months of the Blitz, they became lifelines. People learned to reinforce them using materials scavenged from bombed buildings. The ceiling was the weak point, so carpenters and builders advised layering spare doors across the joists, creating a crude beam system. Then came the protection layer: piles of earth, sandbags, or rubble, packed tightly to absorb the force of nearby explosions. Even if the house above collapsed, that small chamber often remained intact, a miracle of makeshift engineering. In poorer neighborhoods without basements, garden trenches became the solution. Families dug narrow pits, 4 to 6 feet deep, roofed them with planks or old floorboards, and heaped soil on top. What began as desperation soon turned into innovation. The early trench shelters were crude, cold, damp, and quick to flood. But Britons learned fast. By 1941, leaflets advised lining the trench walls with wooden boards or sandbags and adding a sloped roof to shed rain and deflect blast pressure. In some rural areas, builders mixed lime and clay into the soil to harden the walls. It wasn't an official method, but it worked. Lime reacted with moisture, forming a chalk-like barrier that kept mold and rot away, and even deterred insects. To disguise the shelters, people planted shrubs or built sheds over the top. Ventilation pipes poked up like fence posts, allowing air to flow while keeping the structure invisible from the sky. Visibility meant death. A single glint of metal could attract an enemy bomber. So, concealment was as vital as construction. Many entrances were hidden under coal chute covers, garden gates, or even floorboards in a shed. Some families camouflaged their shelters with chicken coops or tool benches, making them indistinguishable from the rest of the yard. Children grew up playing over the very roofs that would one day save their lives. This creativity blurred the line between engineering and art, survival through disguise. Britain in wartime was a nation of shortages. Concrete, steel, even nails were rationed for the military. Yet necessity bred innovation. When a bomb destroyed a street, the next morning neighbors would gather to salvage. Doors became ceiling beams, floorboards became walls, bricks were pried from rubble and reused. Old chimneys provided clay liners that served as ventilation ducts. Pipes from wrecked plumbing became drainage channels. Every scrap mattered, and nothing was wasted. This spirit of reuse laid the foundation for a new kind of engineering: civilian resilience by design. While civilians improvised, British scientists quietly studied the physics of survival. Tests at the Ministry of Home Security's experimental stations showed that angled and curved surfaces deflected blast waves better than flat ones. That's why Anderson shelters were arched. Pressure slid over them instead of crushing them. Civilians unknowingly applied the same principle: sloped roofs, rounded trenches, compacted earth. Even without formal training, they were building according to real blast-resistance physics. It was proof that intelligence in war wasn't limited to laboratories. It lived in the hands of everyday builders. When the sirens wailed, families gathered their bedding, food tins, and lanterns, then descended underground. The shelters were dark, musty, and cramped. But they represented safety. Straw or Hessian sacks softened the floor. A candle or small oil lamp glowed against lime-washed walls, the white surface reflecting light and killing bacteria. Children fell asleep to the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns. Above them, the world shook, but below, life continued in miniature, quiet, patient, determined. In those spaces, neighbors shared tea, stories, and fear. The shelters weren't just protection, they were symbols of unity. Historians often talk about the Blitz spirit, the idea that Britain endured through cheerfulness and courage. But that spirit wasn't abstract. It was built, plank by plank, by people who refused to surrender. The woman who reinforced her coal cellar with scrap timber. The retired carpenter who taught his street how to brace a trench wall. The volunteers who dug shelters for the elderly next door. Their quiet work saved thousands of lives, far more than official records will ever show. Even after raids destroyed entire blocks, survivors emerged from underground, brushed off the dust, and began repairing what remained, often using materials from the same rubble that had nearly killed them. Today, their designs seem primitive, but their logic remains sound. Layering materials distributes impact. Curving walls and ceilings reduces pressure shock. Packed soil or sand absorbs fragments and fire. Lime coatings preserve, strengthen, and disinfect. And ventilation prevents the buildup of gas and moisture. Modern survival shelters, from storm bunkers to off-grid root cellars, still rely on these same principles. The knowledge forged in the 1940s is quietly alive in 21st century engineering. There was also a psychological genius in these designs. Being underground gave civilians a sense of control in a war where they had none. The act of building the shelter itself, of hammering doors into beams, of shoveling soil, was therapy. It gave fear a purpose, and that sense of participation in one's own safety was one reason morale held strong through months of bombardment. Resilience wasn't only physical, it was emotional architecture. Today, as the world faces new uncertainties, natural disasters, wars, or energy crises, the lessons of the Blitz shelters return with new relevance. Preparedness doesn't require wealth or technology. It requires knowledge, adaptability, and community. A homeowner today could reinforce a basement, apply lime plaster, and create a ventilated storm shelter using the same low-tech methods devised 80 years ago. These techniques still outperform many expensive modern solutions when resources are scarce. The home front showed that survival isn't about hiding from danger. It's about understanding it and building smarter than it can destroy. Most of those wartime shelters are long gone, filled in, forgotten, or hidden under suburban lawns. But occasionally, one is rediscovered. A wooden door buried beneath soil, or a rusted air pipe sticking out behind an old garden shed. When archaeologists uncover them, they find not just structures, but stories, evidence of families who refused to give up. Their craftsmanship, born of necessity, outlasted the war itself. In the end, the hidden shelters of the Blitz were more than survival spaces. They were proof that courage can be built with bare hands, that knowledge can protect more lives than any weapon, and that even in the darkest nights, light survives underground. If this story of forgotten engineering inspired you, Subscribe to Forgotten Survival. Each week, we uncover the real survival knowledge that kept our ancestors alive when the world collapsed, and the lessons that can still protect us today. Because history doesn't just tell us what happened. It teaches us how to endure.